We're going to be ordaining Brother Bill Wright and Cody Crosby and Ben Hawthorne. If y'all can come up with some really difficult theological questions that we can ask, y'all submit those to me. And yeah, I've already got one. What are the 5 essential doctrines of the Christian faith? That's a good one to start off with. That'll be question number 1. I promise you, I will not be allowing questions like that. Okay, so. But anyway, grateful that you are here. If you can go ahead and be finding Hebrews chapter 11. We've not started yet. We're going to give it a couple more minutes. You're looking at verses 32 through 40. You're going to see that the writer of Hebrews transitions a little bit from what we've been used to over the last several weeks. He now begins to speak in terms of summary compared to specific details. They're going to be over here, Charlie and Vicky. They're going to be on the offering receptacle. So many things are put on those side tables, and wanted to try to get rid of the confusion of picking up the wrong thing. I'm still getting used to this big hunker of a Bible I've got. I think I've already built up some strength already. Yeah, don't have to work out. This thing is, I'm just telling you, look how big this thing is. My other one was about like that, right? And it is super heavy. I don't know if I really like it or not. It's just too heavy. Well, I do still need glasses. Somebody asked that question, do I still need glasses? I do. And the reason why I put them on and take them off, I put them on so I can read, and I take them off because these are not prescription glasses. They're what they call the old cheaters. You put them for reading glasses. So if I put them on and I'm looking at you, you look blurry. Right. What I need to do is just go get a regular eye exam and just get those glasses that you can transition from. And so when I'm looking at you, I don't like looking at you blurry, all right? You look like a big blob with these glasses on. So I try to make eye contact with. Say it again. I didn't say black. Did I use the word fat? No, Charlie, don't be putting words in my mouth. I did not use that 3-lettered cuss word, right? I did not use the word fat. No. Are we recording that part? Okay. I want to make sure I was quoted properly, right? I said, you look like a big blob, is what I said. Okay, well, but you're not blobs, right? It just, if you use these glasses and you look at, I promise you'll think, well, Bill, you look just like a blob, brother. Light, L-I-T-E? Okay. See, Charlie opened up Pandora's box, huh?
Hebrews like that word. That's what they sacrifice, the fat of the animal.
That's true. Hey, come on in. There's a handout on the...
One left.
Is there just one left? Okay, good. We were just waiting for you to get here before we started, so your timing's impeccable. All right, we'll go ahead and you can go ahead and start recording, or we're going live. I hope I didn't say anything in that interim there, right? Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 through 40. We're going to complete our study of Hebrews 11. Jeff and Adam have been asking me about have I been able to track where we will be when we'll finish the book of Hebrews, because we're going to kind of move to something new and unique, hopefully, by the end of April. And we should be done with our study of Hebrews by April the 19th. April the 19th, we should wrap up our study of the book of Hebrews. I think after tonight we got either 8 or 9 more studies, if I mapped it out correctly, all right? And I look back to see when we started. We actually started in May of last year. So we're making quite a bit good progress going through the book of Hebrews. I hope that you've enjoyed our study. Out of curiosity, I know we have some former military among us. How many of you served in the military? You see, what were you in? Army? Jack was in Navy. Army. All right, was it got? So the Army's got the Navy outnumbered tonight, right? Charlie, Air Force. There you go. Yeah, go Air Force. Got 2 sons in the Air Force myself. Talked to both of them today. They're both doing really, really good. So grateful to the Lord for those of you. Thank you again for serving our country in the various armed forces. I was hoping that there'd be somebody from the Marines because the Marines have a motto. Does anybody know what that motto is? Semper Fidelis. Does anybody know what it means? It means always faithful, right? Always faithful. When you stop and think about that, you could really kind of hang that as a plaque above Hebrews chapter 11 because it is the great faith chapter. In fact, 1 Corinthians 4:2. Anybody got a quick hands? 1 Corinthians 4:2. Nobody going to take me up on my... Thank you. We got a guy that's using his phone. There you go. Can you read that, Mr. Patterson? 1 Corinthians 4:2. If this is the wrong verse, I'm going to feel like a nut.
It says, moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful.
That's it. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be what? Found faithful. Now, isn't that true that ought to be not only what you and I are, but also what we do? We are to be faithful, and we are to practice faithfulness. Faithfulness to the Lord, and really faithfulness to one another, right? Faithfulness to the Lord and His church. So that's really what the entire theme of the book of Hebrews chapter 11 is all about. Fortunately, we are given these various illustrations of these Old Testament characters that provide an illustration for you and I. And again, these individuals, we kind of make them to be superheroes, but they were very much like you and I. They were not perfect whatsoever, just like you and I are not perfect. Anybody perfect in the house? Again, you just blew it, right? Because none of us are perfect. They had their flaws, but what do they teach us? What do they illustrate for you and I? They illustrate this, that you know what? You can trust God for any circumstance. And all of these individuals, they would come up with these various obstacles that they would face, and they would always show that you can trust God, that the Christian life really is a life of faith. And we've already seen in Hebrews 11, verse 6, that it is impossible to please God without faith. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. For those who come to God must believe that He is, and He's a diligent rewarder to those who seek Him. Okay? Now, up to this point, verses 1 through 31, he's been giving us, the writer of Hebrews has been giving us specific individuals, giving their names, giving us their situations, and how by faith they did this, this, and this. Now when you come to verse 32, to the end of the chapter, he's now going to speak in terms of summary. In fact, let me just read verses 32 through 40 just so we can begin to wrap our minds around it, and we'll come back and we'll unpack it, okay? Hebrews chapter 11, beginning in verse 32, here's what he says. These are his concluding statements to this great chapter of faith. He says, "What more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell you." He said, "I've got a whole lot more that I could tell you, but for the purpose, I'm just going to summarize this for you." That's what he's basically saying. "For what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell you." And then he mentions 6 names. Watch this. He says of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. Now, how many of you have heard of all 6 of those names? Surely you've heard of those names. Many of them you can actually find in the book of Judges and the kings and the prophets, right? Verse 33, he says, "Who through faith," now watch this, "subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, and turned to fight, turned to flight rather, the armies of the aliens. He says, women received their dead raised again. Now, a lot of people would come to verses 32 through the beginning part, verse 35, and say, man, that's what life of faith is all about. Man, it's just victory after victory after victory. Where do I sign up? Well, right in the middle of verse 35, notice what it says. Rather than women receiving their dead raised to life, watch what it says. It says, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Of whom he says the world was not worthy. They wandered in desert and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All these, he says, obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive not just a promise, but what? Mark that phrase, the promise. The promise there in the latter part of verse 39. And I submit to you, if the writer of Hebrews could come up with a better ending to this great faith, this great chapter of faith, I don't know how he would have done it. Because I think this verse 40 is a perfect summary verse. He says, God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. He basically goes all the way back to the beginning part of Hebrews chapter 1 and talking about who Jesus is and what he means to you and I and the role that he serves in our lives, and gives a great summary statement there in verse 40. Now, the main point of verses 32 through 40 is that the life of faith in the Lord Jesus and the life of faith of God is possible to all believers. Faith is not a luxury that's been given to a select group of Christians, but rather it is something that you and I absolutely positively need to lean on every day of our lives. That is trusting God in every circumstance. Not just trusting God for what he says he will do, but trusting God in every circumstance of life. It is a daily practice that you and I need to practice. Faith is necessity. It's necessary, rather, for us all. And all of God's people said. Now, what is faith? Faith, again, if you go back to chapter 11, verse 1, we have the summary definition of what faith is. What is faith? Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. Even though we cannot see it, we see it as if it already exists, because with God it already does. Okay? God said it, therefore I believe it. God has declared it, I choose to trust him in all circumstances. Well, with that thought or that introduction kind of out of the way, let's begin unpacking verses 32 through 40. And I want you to think with me just for a little bit that what we need faith for. Why is faith necessary? And I want to give you 3 specific things of why or what we need faith for. For example, we need faith, first of all, to succeed. And if I were to choose another word that didn't start with the letter S, I would choose this. We need faith to overcome. So I want you to put in the parentheses out beside that, when we're talking about faith to succeed, we need faith to overcome. And that's exactly what you have in verses 32 through 35. You have these summary statements, if you will, of people who had to have faith or had to use their faith to overcome obstacles that they were pressed against. For example, look at verse 32. He says, "And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon." All right, we know who Gideon is. Remember, and we're going to look at him in just a moment. We find the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6, Judges chapter 7, and Judges chapter 8. So you can just go ahead and put your finger there in Hebrews 11 and be turning to the book of Judges chapter 6. And I want you to see that although he lists these 6, he referenced them by name. Okay, that's that first subpoint. He references these individuals who exercise faith to overcome or exercise faith to succeed in what God called them to do and when God called them to do it. Okay? They're referenced by name, and he gives us these 6 names. And I wish we had the time to look at all 6 of these. But I thought for time purposes tonight, because the writer of Hebrews gives us summary statements about these, I'm going to choose to do the same thing. We're just going to summarize just one of them, right? So Judges chapter 6, let's look at the story of Gideon just real quick. Let's look at how God called him. Now, if you remember the story of Judges, there's this recurring theme that after a judge, a ruler would die off. You find this statement 3 or 4 times in the book of Judges. It said, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And you have this cyclical problem going on. They would rebel against God, and then God would raise up the enemies of the children of Israel to come and wreak havoc on them. And then the people would go, oh, mercy, mercy, God, we're so sorry. God, forgive us of our sins, cleanse us. And so God would hear their prayer, and then he would send a judge, he would send a deliverer in to rescue them from their calamities, and things would be great. And then that judge would die off, and then guess what? They'd go right back into the same cycle. Every man would do that which was right in his own eyes. God would send in another group to judge them, to be very harsh on them, and they would repent, and then God would send a judge, a deliverer come in, and he would deliver them from their enemies, and then they be hunky-dory, and then again that judge would die, and the cycle would be over and over and over again. So when we come to Judges chapter 6, they had rebelled against God. If you look at chapter 6, verse 1, it says, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them to the hand of Midian for 7 years. And so God would wreak havoc on them, or allow these enemies of the people of God to wreak havoc on them as a way of judging them. And the part of judging that is to get them to turn to Him, right, in repentance. Now, if you fast forward to verse 11, the man that God's going to use to defeat the Midianites is this guy named Gideon. How many of you ever heard the story of Gideon? All right, that's the majority of you. This is what I get. It's kind of interesting here because of the approach in the calling of Gideon here. This is verse 11 of Judges chapter 6. It says, and the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from the Midianites. So keep in mind, the children of Israel they're being just hounded and punished, if you will, by the Midianites. The Midianites was a bad group of people. And so Gideon, he's just a farmer. He's just a country boy, so to speak. And so he's hiding the wheat, trying to keep it from being garnished by the Midianites, right? And so he's in the barn doing his thing as a farmer. And it's in that setting that the angel of the Lord comes to Gideon, verse 12. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, now watch this, the Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor. And I can almost get the imagery. He's threshing that wheat. The angel of the Lord calls him a mighty man of valor. Did somebody else come in? I promise you, he didn't think he was a man of valor. He was very intimidated by the Midianites. And look what it says here. Verse 13, and Gideon said to him, O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? Where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites. Then the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you? And again, he's probably thinking, me? God, have you forgotten just how bad a group of people these are? You're going to send me to do battle against them? You're going to send me to deliver our people from them? Verse 15, so he said to him, O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan, he says, is the weakest in Manasseh. He said, And again, God just called him what? A mighty man of valor? Do you not understand who you're talking to, Lord? Maybe you picked maybe you didn't realize who you were talking to. My group, my descendants are the weakest of all those in Manasseh. And I'm the least in my father's house. By the way, does that sound like somebody from the book of Exodus? What about Moses? Moses made every excuse. Gideon has given God all of these excuses, but look at what verse 16 says. Read it with me. And the Lord said to him, surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man. Isn't that an amazing thing? Then he said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who will talk with me. And you remember the sign? Remember the fleece? Remember, it wasn't just good enough to do it once. He said, all right, God, if this is really of you, I'm going to take this fleece, I'm going to take this wool, and I'm going to put it on the ground. And he says, here's what I want you to do. He says, I want the ground to be completely wet and the fleece be dry. He said, if this is really of you, then I'll believe you. And God does exactly that. Then he comes out there and discovers the ground is wet and the fleece is dry. And he's thinking, well, let's do 2 out of 3. Then he says, okay, all right, God, forgive me. I don't mean to cross the line here, but now make the fleece wet and the ground dry. Now, was God under any obligation to do that for him? Sometimes we can be the same way. God, just show me a sign. I'm not going to ask you how many of you have ever done that, because I've done that before. God says, you don't need a sign. All you need is my word. And that's where faith comes in. God has declared it. What did God tell Gideon? Look, you're going to go defeat the Midianites as if it were one man. And guess what? Here's why you're going to do it. Because I'm going with you. Right? Well, now look at chapter 7. Verse 1. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon. Jerubbaal and Gideon is one and the same guy. And all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. Now watch what God says. Now, the Midianites outnumbered Gideon and his band of 32,000 men by tenfold. There were roughly 320,000 of the Midianites. And so I'm already thinking that Gideon's thinking, you know what? Man, we were outnumbered 10-1 here. But we're going to give it our best shot, right? Well, look what happens. Verse 2. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are not enough. He didn't say not enough. What does he say, church? And the Lord said to Gideon, the people who are with you are too many. Now watch this. Not for you, but for me to give the Midianites to their hands. Lest Israel, watch this, claim glory for itself against me, saying, my own hand has saved me. He said, I don't want you to think that your band of 32,000 men pulled this off. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to have to pare down your group of 32,000. And he does. Now keep in mind, they're already outnumbered 10-1. Look what happens. Verse 32. Now therefore proclaim in the hearing of the people, and saying, whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn and depart at once from Mount Gilead. And how many of them left? Can you imagine? Can you imagine the dust storm that those 22,000 kicked up? Because they couldn't wait to leave. All right, here's the deal. I'm sure Gideon's thinking, man, maybe 1 or 2. All right, God's told me to tell y'all, if any of you are scared, you can go home. Boom! The grass wasn't growing under them. Think about that. From 32,000, 22,000, beeline out of there. Now, I'm no math genius, but 32,000 minus 22,000 is 10,000. Thank you, Barbara. Now they're seriously outnumbered if they weren't already, right? And Gideon's thinking, okay, Lord, wow. Verse 4, but the Lord said to Gideon, the people are Now, if I'm Gideon, I'm thinking, God, you've got to be kidding me. The Lord are still too many. I mean, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Then it will be that of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, and the other shall go with you. And whoever I say to you, this one shall not go with you, the same shall not go. And he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps from the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set apart by himself. Likewise, everyone who gets down on his knees to drink, the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. So the purpose was this. I'm not going to get all the way down because some of you can't see it, and plus I'm old. But you get the imagery here. The difference is if one gets on all fours, and puts his mouth to the water, so to speak, okay, versus the one who's like this, right? And how many are the ones that did this? 300. Now, why was that such a big deal? Because they were alert, right? If you got your head down, you cannot see the enemy coming, right? But God's also doing something here. Okay, he said, this is the test that I'm using to disperse the group here, because I'm going to get it down to a number that I feel like that I can use, right? And how many of this group? Look what happened. He's down to 10,000 men, right? So this test is put on. Verse 6, it says, and the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people got down on their knees to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, by the 300 men who lapped, he says, I will save you. Deliver the Midianites into your hand, and deliver the Midianites into your hands, and let all the other people go, and every man to his place. Now think about this. He started out with 32,000, and now he's down to a measly 300 men. Wow.
Against 320,000.
Say it again.
Against 320,000.
Plus, yeah. Verse 9. It says, verse 8 says, and so the people took provisions and their trumpets in their hands, and he went away, all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained those 300 men. Now the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Now let me ask you this. Did faith play a role here? How did faith play a role here?
Trust in the Lord, you're going to get it with 300 men.
Yeah, because 300 men, I mean, you do that. I mean, even from the world's perspective, and I think even from our human perspective, we would say, man, the odds are this, 320,000 against 300. This war is going to be over very, very quick. And there's not going to be much left. Matter of fact, there won't be anything left at the 300. They're going to be wiped out clean, right? So it took faith. Think about it. He started out with 32,000. He was already down 10 to 1. I don't know what the number is once you get 320,000 down to 300, what the odds are then. Jules got it in his mind. Whatever it is, it's overwhelming odds, right? Overwhelming odds. And so, but God's going to use this. And again, God's the one that's paring this down, because God's going to say, I want you to see this. I'm going to do this on your stead. I'm going to do this. It's not going to, none of you guys will be able to take credit for this. Well, look at chapter 8. Verse 1. Now the men of Ephraim said to him, why have you done this to us by not calling us when you went to fight? Well, this is the wrong one. This is a kind of summary. When Gideon came to the Jordan, he and the 300 men who were with him crossed over, exhausted but still in pursuit. Then he said to the men of Succoth, please give loaves of bread to the men. This is not the passage I was looking at. Well, anyway, in chapter 7, there is a great destruction of the Midianites because God brought the defeat of the Midianites. Because why? Gideon exercised faith and trust in God to do it. In fact, Gideon and them didn't even have to fire a single shot. They blew their horns, they broke their pictures, right? And they thought, oh my gosh, the children of Israel, they've got us outnumbered. And there was such chaos, they basically folded within, right? And so the whole point being of this is that it takes faith to overcome. It takes faith to succeed. And when you look at this passage of Scripture in Hebrews chapter 11, go back to Hebrews chapter 11. I know I'm kind of scatterbrained tonight, forgive me. But in Hebrews chapter 11, when he talks about Gideon, he talks about Barak, he talks about Jephthah in verse 32 of Samson. You remember the story of Samson. We won't go into great detail about that. Samson defeated the Philistines. There came a time when he got duped by Delilah. His eyes were gouged out. His hair was cut. And then he was made fun of. Remember that? He was kind of the circus elephant or the circus clown. And he just said, God, if you'll give me strength one more time. You remember what that? He put him between those two pillars. God gave him the strength. He pushed those two pillars over. The whole Colosseum collapsed. And literally it was a great fall of the Philistines. But Samson died in that as well. But again, we think of this exercising of faith. When you and I are faced with obstacles in our lives, and obstacles will come. Some things that, from a human perspective, man, it's against all odds. But God, you said that you would give me the victory. God, you tell me that you would help me overcome. And God, I'm going to believe you. I'm going to trust you. And that's exactly what these guys did. Whether it be Gideon, whether it be Barak, whether it be Samson, whether it be Jephthah, or David, or Samuel, and the prophets. And so we see, first of all, that it takes faith, or we need faith to succeed. We need faith to overcome. And then we see the beginning, some were referenced by name. Others were referenced by fame. Look at verses 33 through 35. And by fame, I mean we're not given specific names here. We're actually given events. There is no names ascribed to the listings of verse 33 through 35, but we can probably figure out who they're talking about. Let me reread verses 33 through 34 and 35, and you begin to think who you think they might be talking about here. He says, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness, were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to fight in the armies of the aliens. In verse 35, he says, women received their dead, raised to life again. So we look at that beginning portion there all the way through verse 35. Others were tortured, he says, not accepting deliverance. They might obtain a better resurrection. Let's go back to subduing of kingdoms. Who do you think he's talking about there, if you had to guess? I'm hearing all kinds of names. You said Samson, David. You know who I'm thinking about? Joshua would be another, right? And there's not a right or wrong answer. I wrote down in my own notes, I thought Moses. Let me tell you why Moses. And even though he's already done a great deal of talking about Moses, what nation did Moses have to deal with? The nation of Egypt, right? But certainly Joshua would fall into that category. What are some other names y'all threw out? David. David would be another. I think David falls in another one of these categories too, by the way. Yeah. Daniel. Okay, good one. Anybody else? All right. Look at the next one. He says, verse 33, he says, who through faith subdued kingdoms. Again, Moses had to exercise faith because God told him to, hey, deliver my people from Egypt, right? And had to face a formidable foe in Pharaoh. What about this next one? He says, stop the mouths of lions. That's a dead giveaway, isn't it? Yeah. Daniel. We think about Daniel and the lion's dens. As the old joke goes that when he was tossed into the den of hungry lions, spent the night with the lions, as somebody jokingly said, Daniel is proof positive that you can read between the lines. I know it's not original to me. I know you've heard that before, huh?
What about his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach?
We're getting to that. Maybe we see them too, right? So verse 33, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises. Again, I think it could be any number of people. It could be Moses. It could be Daniel. It could be Abraham. Yeah, think about that. Abraham and his dealings with Egypt. The covenant too, right? What about, and stop the mouths of lions? I think that's got to be Daniel, right? What about, let's see, verse 34, quench the violence of fire. Does anybody know what their Hebrew names were? I'm not even going to repeat that.
I wouldn't.
Yes, I will, 'cause I'm going to ascribe it to Egier. He said, oh, we're recording, so I'm not going to say that. Anybody? Azariah? Does anybody know the names? Mishael, right?
Mishael.
It's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are the three, right? Those are their Hebrew names. We know them better by their Babylonian names. All right, now we can say this together. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we know this from Daniel chapter 3. Remember the story Nebuchadnezzar had? And this is from a group that were very jealous of the roles that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were playing in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And they knew that they didn't worship this false god that they had erected. So they talked Nebuchadnezzar into erecting this gold statue of himself, and then when the music was played, whatever it was played during the day, everybody was supposed to stop what they're doing and bow down and worship that. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego says, no, we're not going to do that. And this infuriated Nebuchadnezzar. If you remember the story there in Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar comes in, look, guys, I'm going to give you another chance. If you don't do it, then you give me no option but to throw you into the fiery furnace. And remember what they said? I love what they said. They had that but if not clause in their faith, because here's what they said, "O king, we don't even have to stop and think about it. We're not troubled. We don't have to pray about it. Matter of fact, we know that our God can deliver us. But if not, that is, if He chooses not to deliver us from the fiery furnace, we're still not going to bow down to your image." And that made Nebuchadnezzar think, you know what? All right, you convince me. We won't do that. That's not what he did, right? Matter of fact, he made it 7 times hotter. And even those who tossed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace, they were incinerated. That's how hot it was. But remember what happened? He looked in, and what did he see? He didn't see 1, he didn't see 2, he didn't see 3. He saw 4. And he said, and the 4th one looked like the Son of God. Isn't that awesome that God doesn't just let us go through the fire, but He's in the fire with us? What else? So we've looked at subdued kingdoms, work righteousness, obtain promises, stop the mouths of lions. We think that's Daniel, quench the violence of fire, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What about escape the edge of the sword? Who do you think that pertains to? I'm thinking David as it relates to Saul, right? Now, why would David have to escape the sword of Saul? Yeah, Saul, you remember the story there in Kings, right? The story was that David killed his 10,000s and Saul killed his thousands. And so Saul was insanely jealous of David because David was getting all of the applause and the praise. Became insanely jealous, even though he knew that God had ripped the kingdom from him, was in the process of doing that anyway. And so David had to go on the run. Remember that? And his running was not just to drive him out. Saul was dead set on killing David. Well, let's move on. We got to keep moving. He says, became valiant in battle and turned to fight the armies of the aliens. Who do you think that was? This is where I think it was Joshua. Joshua encountered many, many cities and many, many battles along the way. And again, talking about faith, exercising faith, because God would say, I would go with you. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And then he says, women received their dead to life again. Who do you think that was? I got somebody in mind.
Lazarus.
Talking about Old Testament.
Oh, the woman.
The Shunammite woman, right? Remember that in Elisha?
Yeah.
Remember God says, hey, he came to her and she said, hey, I've got just enough oil to make my son in a cake. We're going to do this and we're going to die. There's a big drought in the land, and we're just going to eat this, and we're going to die. He said, no, if you'll do this for me, he said, I promise you, you'll have not just a little bit of oil, but you'll have oil more than enough. Remember that? And she did it, and God did that. And then later on, Elisha came to see her, and he says, how are things going? And this time, she's lividly mad because her son died. Remember that? And she said, you know what? Have you come back to taunt me? Have you come back to torment me? My son is dead. And what did Elisha do?
Went upstairs and laid his body on it.
Yeah, laid his body on that dead boy's body, and by the grace of God, he raised that boy back from the dead. 2 Kings chapter 4 is the story of that. I think it's the... But then notice what else he says in verse 35. He says, others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. Now, I don't necessarily have a group or an individual that I thought of. Do any of you? Well, we're talking about Old Testament, okay? These are Old Testament examples. Certainly, we think about the New Testament disciples, that many of them, matter of fact, every single one of them except one died a martyr's death. Anybody know who the one was? John, right? Every one of them died a martyr's death except John. Certainly, I think, Sharon, you would be accurate in that if we're talking about New Testament. But these seem to be all Old Testament illustrations for us. But there's no evidence that he was tortured to die, right? Right? He certainly went through trouble like none of us have ever seen. I know that we kind of get in our little pity parties. Any of you ever had a pity party? Any of you ever had a pity party? How many of you said, I've never had a pity party in my life? I don't believe you. I think all of us, because of, whether we made it public or voiced it, I think internally we've all had a pity party. All of us have. Felt sorry for ourselves. But I can promise you this, when you think about troubles that you've been through, and I'm not trying to water down anything that any of you have ever went through. I've gone through some difficult times in my life. I'll tell you one thing to get over your pity party real quick. Go to a children's medical center. That'll get you over a pity party in a New York minute. I can promise you that. I'm feeling sorry for myself one day in my last church, and I had to go to Children's Medical Center in just outside of downtown Dallas, and walking through the halls to go visit a patient, seeing these little bitty babies hooked up to tubes. I mean, tubes coming out almost every port of their body. I'm thinking, oh my, Lord, forgive me for being a baby, so to speak, about what I'm going through. Look at these parents. They don't know if their child's going to survive or not. And all that they're going through. God, forgive me for having a little pity party and what I'm going through. It compares nowhere to what they're going through, right? Somebody look up 1 John chapter 5, verse 4. Again, we're talking about it takes faith, or we need faith rather to succeed. We need faith to overcome. Here's a verse, if you're not turning there, I want you to write it down in your notes somewhere under this last subpoint. 1 John chapter 5, verse 4. Anybody got it? Go ahead, Holly.
For whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith.
What is the victory that overcomes the world and all that the world has to offer? Spell it with me. F-A-I-T-H. Faith. Forsaking all, I take him. So we need faith, number one, to succeed. Number two, very quickly, I've got to pick up the pace. Number two, we need faith to stand. And by stand, I don't mean posture like this, okay? If you go from a seated position to a standing position, but rather I'm talking about the ability to withstand, right? Because beginning in verse 36 through 38, up to this point in our study in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, we always seeing it's victory after victory after victory. And again, as I said by way of introduction, many people say, okay, man, where do I sign up? Man, I see all these successes and all of these things, these wonderful things that are happening through the lives of these people who walk through faith in God. But then when you come to verse 36 through 38, all you see is despair. You see perplexity. Look at it, verse 36 through 38. He says, still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two. Literally, you think about a saw sewing somebody in two, and this is not a magic act, but literally being sawn in two. They were tempted, they were slain with a sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom he says the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. Oh. Well, what do we see? I think we see two specific things here. Number one, we see their suffering, faith to stand, and you might even put in brackets again. For alliteration purposes, I put these letters start with S. Point number one, we think about faith to succeed. We're talking about faith to overcome. If I'm looking at verse 36 through 38, I'm thinking at faith to withstand pressure, to withstand not just peer pressure, but you talk about persecution, right? Withstanding persecution. In verse 36, 37, we see their suffering. What did they endure? Look at the description here. He talks about trial of mockings. Do you see that? What does that mean? That is that they were sarcastically attacked. They were sarcastically attacked. How many of you, your mom or dad told you, especially your mom, more than likely, your grandma, I've used this illustration before, but when I was a little kid, it used to bother me greatly. It doesn't bother me more because I've gotten used to it, I guess. My last name being Coffee, even though it's not like the drink, it's not Coffee. For those of you that fill out coffee cards. For those of you that fill out Christmas cards, it's not EE, it's EY, okay, Coffey. And so I would get all of the butt of the jokes of, what kind of coffee are you? Are you Folgers? Are you Maxwell House? Are you this? And I think I told you that our coaches, because me and my brothers were close to the same age, one of us was Coffee Cake, the other was Coffee Grounds, and one of us was Coffee Cup, I think. I think I was Coffee Cup. And so constantly having our name made fun of, and I just got tired of it because it was just day in and day out. I would go as a little kid crying to my mom, and my mom would say this to me, Bill, come on now. Let's say it all together. I know you've heard that too. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Or names, I think was the term my mom used to say, but names will never hurt me. Is that true? No. It's true that sticks and stones may break your bones, but let me tell you something. Names and words hurt. They are damaging. And that's the reason why you and I need to be real careful about what we say to one another too. We may say something and, hey, I'm joking, I'm kidding, but we also got to know the audience in which we're speaking it to. Some people can handle jokes like that. Some people are a lot more sensitive. And you say, well, that's their responsibility. They just need to build a bridge and get over. No. That's your responsibility too. And if we say hurtful things, we say hurtful words, it's a lot like this. It's a lot like taking a pillowcase stuffed full of feathers, taking a knife and ripping it open and letting 100-mile-an-hour wind blow those feathers just everywhere, and then going back and trying to get every single one of them and put them back in the pillows. What are the odds of that happening? No, the damage is done. The damage is done. So we know that names hurt. These individuals, they said they went through trials and marking. They were sarcastically attacked. But watch this. It gets worse. Not only were they sarcastically attacked, they had trial and mockings, but the Bible says that they were scourged. Yes, of chains and imprisonment. That word scourging, are you familiar with that term? If you're familiar with, again, I've asked this question many times about the Passion of the Christ. Have you ever seen that movie? How many of you seen that movie? Did that part impact you at all when Jesus was going through the scourging, talking about the whipping and things that he endured? I know that, who's the guy that played Jesus? Jim Caviezel. Am I saying that right? He talked about that they had a plate on his back to keep from filling it right, and then obviously it had the makeup and things like that. He said one time that the guy swung that whip, it missed the plate and hit him. He said it literally took my breath away. He said I can only imagine what Jesus endured. So think about this. So they're not only enduring the verbal assault, but there's also the physical assault that they were going through. They were beaten. What about chains and imprisonment? They were chained. That is, they were thrown into jail. And you think, well, man, I can respect it, but that's never going to happen to us. I think it's coming. I do. If the Lord tarries, now we've endured some of the trial of mockings. People make fun of us. Oh, you religious nuts and da-da-da-da-da-da. But we're already seeing the scourging going on in third world countries. And even here in the United States, among our teenagers, you think about what happened at Columbine back in the 90s. You know, those kids being asked, hey, here's your chance to renounce Jesus. And I don't know if that was their motive for those two boys shooting his classmates. But he killed some of them because they would not turn their back on Jesus. Think about what's happening in third world countries, especially when you think about ISIS, where heads are being chopped off because they refuse to renounce Christ. People being thrown into jail. Even right now in the Soviet Union, in communist China, in the Middle East, you've had preachers of the gospel who were locked up because they refused to stop preaching. What about those who were stoned and sawn in two? You say, well, what is that? It literally is what it says it is. You think taking a saw blade and cut in two. Others, he says, wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins and being destitute. That is, they suffered, their physical needs were suffering terribly. And then lastly, he talks about being afflicted and tormented. Can you imagine the unreal pressure that these people went through and how they were treated violently by others? Now, you say, what's the whole point of this? Why is the writer of Hebrews giving us all this? The whole point of this is the writer of Hebrews is trying to drive home this. We not only need faith to overcome, but we need faith to withstand. We need faith to succeed, but we also need faith to stand. In the face of what? In the face of persecution. I'm telling you, church, you listen. I'm telling you, the day is coming, and I think it's coming a lot sooner. And I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying this to prepare you. I think the day is coming. We're going to see persecution in America like we've never seen it before. Do you believe that? Yes. Big question is, are we going to need faith? Indeed we are. But we see not only their suffering, but we see their substance. Very quickly, verse 38. It says, of whom the world was not worthy. I love this statement. Whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And if you want to contrast that, you look at verse 34. He says that they quenched the fire, the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Then you come to verse 38. Of whom he is the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves. Talk about two extremes. One success, one victory. The other what we seem like perplexing problems. Now, I'm going to stop preaching and go to meddling here because I thought about this verse all day today and I couldn't get it out of my mind. I wonder what guys like Kenneth Copeland, Joel Osteen, Jesse Duplantis, and guys like that, when they come and read this particular passage of Scripture to their churches, because it doesn't line up with what they preach. Hey, God has promised to bless you. And if God gives Robert $1 million, he's automatically obligated himself to give Sam $1 million. And he'll do that if you'll give me $1 million. But yet when you come to passages of Scripture like this, the Christian life is not a bed of roses and no thorns. God's not promised us sailing across the sea with no choppy waters. Here's what He's promised us. He promised us that we would reach the other side and that He would be with us. That's exactly right. That's right. That's right. And I like this phrase. Look at this phrase, verse 38. He says, of whom the world was not worthy. Think about that. Meaning simply this, that this old world laughed at them. This old world scorned them. This whole world made fun of them. But yet God looked at them and cheered them. Amen. God looked at them and said, these are my choicest saints. This old world was not worthy of them and how they exercised their faith in me. Write this down somewhere. You will never really know the strength of faith until it's put to the test. You agree with that or not? You will never really know the strength of faith until it's put to the test. Adrian Rogers used to put it this way. He said, a faith that cannot be tested cannot be trusted. You will never really know the strength of faith until it's put to the test. You and I want to be true and trusting God regardless of what things look like in our lives, right? None of these people, when you look at this group here in verse 38, he's talking about of whom he says the world was not worthy. You won't find their names listed in a book of who's who. Yet God says, you know what? It's not that they weren't worthy of the world. The world's not worthy of them. The world looks at them and laughs, but God looks at them and cheers. Real quickly, I've got to be done. We need faith to succeed. That is, we need faith to overcome. We need faith to stand. That is, we need faith to withstand persecution. But we also need faith in verse 39 and 40. We need faith to sustain. Faith to sustain. And he mentions two quick things that I want to talk to you about, and I've got to be done because I'm already out of time. I'll go ahead and give you the answers because I'll probably forget to give them to you. Number one, in verse 39, he mentions the promise, the promise. In verse 40, he talks about the perfection. The promise and the perfection. Look at verse 39. He says, "In all these obtained a good testimony through" what means? But what are they missing? They were missing the promise. You say, what in the world is that talking about? Here's what he's talking about. When you look at all of these Old Testament characters, going all the way back to Abel, all the way through to where we just read up to, every one of them put faith in that God would send the promise one, to die for their sins. But guess what? Every single one of those Old Testament characters died before it became a reality. Every single one of them died before it became a reality. The promise here is talking about the coming of Jesus to die on the cross. But guess what? They put faith looking to the cross, and even though it was not realized in their lifetime, they ended up dying before it became realized. Are they today experiencing the benefit of Jesus coming? Amen. Indeed, they are. And Barbara, you've been reading my notes. That's exactly right. I don't know if you heard what Barbara said. She says, and we will, because guess what? They were saved looking to an expectation of Jesus coming and dying on the cross. You and I are saved looking back at Jesus dying on the cross. But here's the thing. How many of you saw Jesus die on the cross?
No.
How many of you saw Jesus get buried? How many of you saw Jesus raised from the dead? And I'm not holding my hand up saying that I did. I'm not doing that at all. The point being is that none of us saw that. So does faith play a role in our lives? Just as they believed God to do what He promised He would do, you and I are looking back with the eyes of faith, trusting God that He did do what He said He would do. And watch this. Not only is it causing you and I to live life now, He's going to give us life and give it to us more abundantly. And I don't think that's futuristic. I think it's now. But guess what? When it comes time for us to die, guess what? We're trusting God. We're exercising faith that, God, you're going to see me home. To be absent from the body is to be present where? With the Lord.
Well, we can all say,
Say it again.
of who we trust and believe.
Say it again.
Of who we trust and believe, we will receive.
Yeah. I know whom I have believed. Right? And what? And am persuaded. That is, I am absolutely convinced, I am confident that He's what? Able to keep that which He's committed for how long? That day. That day. That day. And so verse 40, he says this. I love this. And I think you tie verse 39 and verse 40 together. Okay, they didn't receive the promise, but watch this. Verse 40. God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect. How? apart from us, that we all are experiencing it together. Oh, how important it is that you and I exercise faith in a great God. And let me say it again. I've said it many times over the last several weeks. God has not called us to put faith in faith. That's positive thinking. God's called us to put faith in Him. And that's what makes the difference. And all of God's people said. Questions or comments?
Hey, Brother Bill, you talked about persecution earlier. I think instead of looking at the Middle East, you can look at Europe, what's going on there as a reflection of what's coming our way. A gentleman was arrested in England merely for wearing a pro-life shirt in front of an abortion clinic. Pastor they arrested. I think they had a gentleman in France lately that was arrested for reading scriptures that went against the LGBT lifestyle. So they arrested him. They have this law in England that if you say things that make people uncomfortable, you're breaking the law.
I believe this has probably been about 2 months ago, maybe 3 months ago. There was a woman who was standing outside an abortion clinic who was praying silently and got arrested. Huh? Was it in Canada? I thought it was in England. Yeah. Can you imagine that? Praying silently and got arrested.
Man was asked to leave the Mall of America because he was wearing.
Yes, I saw that. Yeah. Yeah. I'm telling you, folks, it's coming. It's coming. Yeah. This world is not going to get better. And I think what God's doing is He's allowing these things to happen to get us to loosen our grip on this world. Because this world is sinking quickly. Wow.
Look what's happened to Turkey.
Yeah. Say it again?
Look what's happened to Turkey and Syria.
Yeah.
The ground is gone. I mean,
Yeah.
it's opened up.
Yeah.
You ever have a pastor tell you you could witness on the job?
Ever have a pastor?
Yeah, I was told, we were talking about witnessing. I was talking about that CWT and trying to get him interested in it. And he told me, now I don't want you to go out there and witness on the job.
Well, we also know, Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God. We got to be real careful. And it's not that I'm afraid to witness. There's a time and a place for everything, right?
But at Mobile, it had a different atmosphere than other jobs. It was a Christian, started out as a Christian
Yeah.
company. And on Easter, they shut the plant down and we all had Easter service.
Yeah. So I would say that if my employer, if I was working a secular job and my employer said, hey, I don't want you doing this, and we did it anyway, I think that we would not be honoring God in that. I really do.
Like you one-on-one, you out doing a job.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's what he was referring to.
yeah. Anybody else? Oh, aren't you grateful that we serve a God that we can put faith and trust in, regardless of what comes our way?
Praising God about the revival going on.
Yeah, if you have seen that, been reading about this, not only what's happening in Kentucky at Asbury College, but in Tennessee, even reading some stuff that's happening at Texas A&M University. Man, think God can do something at Texas A&M University. He can do it anywhere, right? Y'all know I'm being facetious when I say that. I'm being facetious when I say that. Say that again? Yeah, student-led, right? Student-led. And here's the thing. People have asked me, hey, what do you think about that? What do you think about it? I don't have an opinion on it. Here's what I do know. If God's in it, then we need to be real careful about condemning it, right? Here's what, remember when Peter and them were preaching? And the guy stood up and he said, you know what? He said, I don't know if it's of God or not, but he said, give it time. If it's of God, it'll continue on. If it's not, it'll fizzle out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's fair.
If God's doing the work, man, let's celebrate it. I don't know if God's in all that or not. I don't know. But you know what? I'm not going to condemn it because God may be in that. Here's what I'm praying. God, if you're doing that there, do it here. Do it here. And more importantly, God, do it in me. Do it in me. Prayer requests that you have.